up and just do a little sleep for me.
So under scene?
Yeah.
Creators Interrogate. Take one. Hello, everyone. Thank you for pretending to be on a call with me. Who wants to go first?
Lindsay, I'm so excited to talk to you about this book. I have been hearing you talk about it for a while, so it's great to see it finally ready to come out. I guess my biggest question would be, what was the biggest draft changes you saw as it went from the final stages to the final print stages?
Well, for this book, it got a lot shorter, was the first and most important thing. Because believe it or not, it used to be like 30, 40,000 words longer, and most of that was at the front. And so like in earlier drafts of this, the biggest problem I had was just this really bulky, long Act 1. On the one hand, yeah, it dragged a lot, but on the other hand, it was all stuff that the reader needed to know. So a big challenge was trying to figure out how to make it drag less and make it shorter while also keeping that info in there.
Your books take place in like 2007, 2008. You know, how do you enter that time period? What kind of historical research do you do to put yourself in the mind of someone from 2007, 2008? And do you like doing it?
It's always a fun thought experiment to, when you're writing in the real world, you'll impulsively reach for something that you do and see every day, and then like either I remember, oh, that wasn't a thing back then, or we did it differently back then, or we used flip phones. Like I saw someone on Tumblr kind of joke that the whole reason I said it back then was so I could have the main character have different ringtones for everybody. But that was just like absolutely a thing we did back then, because people called each other even as late as 2007 and 2008, and we don't really do that anymore. So custom ringtones, very rare.
All right, I want to start off with something easy and kind of fun. What made the X-Men such a big deal for you as a teenage girl? I was an X-Men fan as well at the time because of reality. I didn't imagine how X-Men might be as appealing to me as it might be to young girls. And to know that you were probably as big a fan as I was, I just kind of want to hear your story and your connection and what it did for you.
The first and most important thing that you glom onto in a series is going to be the characters. And I, of course, was like, when I was in high school, like late high school, I was like in love with Nightcrawler. Shock, I know. Like I've done like a little content over the years with the Nightcrawler, but Nightcrawler's like kind of like the rare, you know, monster-ish type character that is like happy to be here, and he's not angsty, and he's just here to help. And that even among the X-Men is kind of rare and unusual. I feel the same way about Transformers, is like if there's like a version of the story that you don't really like, there's like, you know, 20 other versions. So if you don't really like the cartoon, we have the movies that like at the time, you know, of course X-Men 3 ruined my life by being so horrible. But X-Men's 1 and 2 were like very, you know, formative for me, because that was sort of the beginning of the new superhero aesthetic. You know, before that superhero movies were silly, and they're like, no, we're gonna try to ground it in realism, which was new. And I think like that was sort of like unique to the X-Men at that time, was they were kind of like trying to pull it back and ground it more in realism, which I think was always kind of the intent. But at the same time, like X-Men was kind of unique in, you know, being sort of an allegory for marginalized communities, and just kind of spoke to anyone who felt like something of an outcast, whether that was like in a political way or a personal way. And so I think that's why X-Men would resound with very socially non-awkward people like ourselves. So what else do we got?
Hey, Lindsay, what's happening? So I read your novel and I got a lot of questions. First off, let me cut right to the chase. The superorganism. What does the superorganism represent? Because I feel personally like you use them as a mechanism to explore themes of xenophobia and fear of the other, which is something that I talk about endlessly inside my own work. So did you draw from any real world events in our current day and age, in our political landscape, to give you some inspiration for the superorganism?
Yeah, I guess especially for the second book, like I actually, I think that is very applicable to your work because, you know, it's silly sci-fi, but I definitely did a lot of research on like how fascist regimes rise and why. Part of it is rooted in this idea of alien biology and like what let's say like if it was gorillas that gained intelligence instead of humans and what just being herbivorous instead of omnivorous would do for you. Kind of creating this alien civilization whose primary modus operandi is rooted in fear and being afraid of the unknown. And like part of it was just like having in the back of my head this post 9/11 era where the United States was, you know, striking first and asking questions later. And so it's kind of really easy to imagine an alien civilization kind of doing the same thing. And I think that is particularly relevant in our current day because I think a lot of strongmen political figures glom onto people's fear and exploit it and use that to rise to power. And so, like, in the case of our alien superorganism, like, it's very far away, it's very oblique, it's only kind of referred to. We never really meet them, at least so far, but you hear about it a lot, and I feel like it's easy to apply our own political landscape because, you know, I feel like ever since 9/11, there's just been all new playbook of exploiting people's fears and using that to gain political power and to hurt less powerful communities. So yeah, I think I definitely had that in the back of my mind.
As a huge science fiction fan, I think my favorite part of your entire trilogy has been how you've used it to basically talk about encountering cultures and what it means to try to understand different groups without having the full context of their culture and their society. And we've seen so many great stories recently kind of delve into that with shows like Shogun. But I think what makes science fiction so potent with that is its ability to sort of completely remove it from a human context and just create this entire society from the author's brain. And I'm just curious to ask you, what were you sort of thinking about when you were developing your alien culture throughout the story, and what did you want to sort of delve into when talking about how we as human beings try to understand the context of something that seems so completely alien to us, and how they think about the universe, the world, and themselves in just a completely seemingly alien way? I just think that was just such a cool aspect of your story that I'm curious to hear more about how you developed it.
Well, I think genre fiction is important because it allows us to kind of explore concepts that in a real world context might be kind of uncomfortable or difficult, but if you kind of remove it from that context and put it in this sort of fantastical context, it becomes more approachable and, you know, can be escapist in a way that's maybe not, like, maybe is helpful or maybe isn't, but like that's why I think it's so popular. That's why I think it remains popular, is it helps give us language to like explore issues of like cultures meeting cultures or different people with different life experiences meeting others. But at the same time, I, you know, was trying to thread the needle of, you know, making it applicable to this idea of like encountering the other, you know, whether the other be like other human cultures or other individuals or like hypothetical alien civilizations without veering into coding. And that I think is like kind of a tricky needle to thread for a science fiction writer. And when I say coding, I mean using shorthand to kind of imply a reference to an actual extant human culture, usually a colonized culture. I think the most obvious example of this that everyone knows and is very obviously that would be the Na'vi in Avatar. How they are just like very over the top, taking like bits and pieces from living human cultures, like, Native Americans or indigenous Polynesians, or, all sorts of indigenous cultures. And that's a very extreme example. I think most writers are going to be a lot more subtle, but I think it's really common, and so you don't want it to go so far in that direction that it just becomes literal in a way that maybe is a little, I guess, appropriative. I say this as not a super huge fan of the Avatar movies, but for those of you who like them, you do you. Okay, who's next?
Every writer has details about their story or their style that are really important to them, that they think about a lot, that may not be immediately obvious to someone reading it. So I was curious if there's a detail about this series or this book or your style which is really important to you that you think about, which may not necessarily be immediately obvious to someone reading Apostles of Mercy.
Well, I think the thing that a writer can never really know when they are, finished or putting something out into the world is how effective they are at communicating whatever the thing is. Like in this case, I think the easy answer and obvious to me would be well, what is the theme? And each one of the books kind of has a very central, simple theme from which all of the, kudzu spreads. Like in the first book, we use this word truth a lot. And basically in that one, I was interested in exploring this whole concept of truth. Is there such a thing as a universal truth? How is that thing wielded by people and oftentimes weaponized, especially in a political context? But in the third book, it's right there in the title. The operative theme is mercy and compassion and stuff like that. Those little things. In exploring that, to get people to reflect on our relationship to this concept of compassion, because I think as for something that we as a culture claim to value as something intrinsic to our being, it's also exceedingly rare, because I think compassion requires an imbalance of power to exist at all. And you have someone in a more powerful position showing someone compassion in a less powerful position, be that social or cultural. My hope is that the themes are obvious enough that it gets people to reflect on them, but not so obvious that it's just okay, we get it.
Every writer kind of has to kill their darlings. What were some of the darling moments or characters or the things that you were excited to put in that you realized didn't really work the right kind of way when you were finished up with this project?
I had a point of view character that I had to cut, and that was there mostly for character building, and because it was a character I enjoyed writing, but it wasn't necessary. It didn't further the plot really. It just kind of added a little bit of texture, and there was a little bit of a plot related mystery in those flashback scenes, but it ultimately made more sense for that information to go into the scenes of the guy who actually solved the mystery rather than the guy who set it up or is the mystery. This is gonna sound weird, but there was a really graphic sex scene. No, I'm not kidding. It was really easy to write. And then very, very late in the game, I realized that our main character was having sex with the wrong person. I had to rewrite it with a different person of a different gender. And yes, it's human on human, just so we're clear.
Okay, so next question. The human interpreter. Cora. I have mixed feelings about the role of Cora because it gave me deja vu to how particular people will serve as translators for diverse cultures and translate a particular message from a diverse culture into a more less seasoned version of it, a less honest or authentic version of what the diverse culture is saying, and they're depicting it and translating it for a more general audience, if you will. What did Cora play a role as, in the allegories of the text? What did Cora represent, and how do you feel about middlemen in between people of diverse cultures and general audiences?
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's a deliberate removal of seasoning with her job as an interpreter. Because in the book, the main character is basically tasked with, I guess I joke it's sort of like the Sigourney Weaver character in Galaxy Quest, where the alien says something to her and her job is to make it accessible. But I think, to your point, people are kind of teed up to take whatever the alien says in bad faith. So her job is to kind of tone it down and make him seem less threatening. So if he says something that could be taken in a bad way or maybe out of context very easily, she tries to reframe it in the way that she sees as acceptable. And especially when at least in the first book, the people she's translating to are representatives of the American government, other invading other countries as they were wont to do at the time. But I think there's also a gendered element to it as well, because I think women have this sort of role in society as sort of a social lubricant. And not always, but a lot of the time, that there's this very gendered element to it. So you have the sort of cultural element where you're basically defanging a foreign, so to speak, culture. But then there's also the interpersonal social element where a lot of times there's people fall into this social role of being sort of peacemaker and using communication to do that. So I think it's kind of both at the same time.
I imagine you won't want to name anything, but do you read fanfics of your book? Do you read fanfics of the Noumena series? And if so, what are some themes in the fandom? What are the fans writing about?
Well, I feel like if you know the basic premise of the books, you could probably guess what the themes are about. That is a very good question. And officially, for legal reasons, I'm supposed to say no. I can't look because I might accidentally do a copyright infringement or something. I learned that from some other authors who say you're absolutely, even if you wanted to, you're not allowed to look. But from what I hear through the grapevine, there's a lot of f***ing.
One big thing that I'm curious about is what was it like for you to be kind of essentially one of the internet's first outwardly known feminists? I don't know if you realize that's a big part of your legacy, but when I think about my introduction to feminism, even being older to you, it was some of your content. How does that strike you now, all these years later?
That's an interesting perspective because I, coming from the world of academia, and by academia, I just mean college, that was just kind of the norm. And so, actually starting to work on the internet and especially with the rise of YouTube and social and sort of just sensing this antipathy to feminism. Again, speaking of things that were 2007, 2008, that was around when I started doing video content. I guess it felt like a necessity to kind of restrict it. And I guess it was 2009, 2010 that I finally started to actually explore those themes. And I think it wasn't received as negatively as I expected it to be, I guess because it was kind of just unusual. There wasn't a framework to be mad at feminism yet. That wouldn't come for another few years. In the super early days, it was okay, sure. It just mostly kind of flew under the radar. In the early 2010s, it kind of started to get that corporate pop feminism thing started to happen. You start seeing BuzzFeed and, Cosmopolitan and now infamous video content studios that kind of turned feminism into a commodity and then therefore kind of laid the ground for, several waves of backlash. And I guess just kind of striking a balance to where you wouldn't piss people off too much was kind of, the only way to do it, and still is.
Which character did you struggle to write the most, or which was the easiest, and kind of why?
I guess honestly, the one I struggled with the most, in terms of point of view characters, has been Cora, and she is the series protagonist, so that, I guess it comes with its own challenge. But once I started introducing other point of view characters, I kind of just found them easier and a lot more fun to write because they kind of are deviations from the default. And also I found that male characters are just easier to write. When the first book came out, there were all these concerns about likability from the publisher and like, do you want to maybe kind of scale this back and make her more likable? And I definitely didn't see those kinds of complaints once I started introducing male point of view characters who were just easier to write because they don't really have this burden of likability from like at least American or English Anglosphere readers. There is less of a concern about like, oh, I don't like that guy. I don't like this character, therefore I don't like the reading experience. So I guess the further I get into it, the more I struggle with the female point of view characters. People want to like the person they're in the head with, and they tend to get more easily on board with male characters, in my experience.
What made you want to specifically talk about the legal understandings of encountering different cultures within an early 2000s framework rather than perhaps a more modern context or a sort of like within our own modern history today, and what this world and history that you built here sort of allows you to do, and what allows you to say that you couldn't do in another setting?
I wanted it to feel grounded. Nostalgia cycles are a thing, and it is just easier to write certain things when you don't have smartphones. Like the removal of smartphones kind of makes the plot a little easier to write because it makes certain things a little more difficult to actually achieve in the narrative. So things that in the real world would be like very easily solvable by Siri, when we go back in time a little bit and remove that, we don't have to really write around like, well, why don't they just use their smartphone? Like, why don't they just use Google Translate? I keep coming back to like this point in history, which is of course 9/11, where just like something snapped, and like this sort of latent xenophobia that's always kind of been there under the surface in American culture was just sort of like widely embraced and has been kind of a backbone of our culture ever since, and I don't see that getting better.
What are some things that keep surprising you or have surprised you about the characters as you've continued to work on them? Is there a character that you didn't always love that has grown on you, and one that you've loved that you really are happy to get a little bit more space away from them now?
A character that I didn't love that grew on me honestly would probably be Nils, Cora's father, who is probably the most evil character in the series. And the reason for that is because like in the first book, like I knew his function in the first book, but I hadn't really settled on what direction I was going with him. Like I hadn't really decided like, is there a possibility of reconciliation? Once I started working on the second book, I came down hard on a conclusion in that direction. And so once I had that direction, it made him a lot more easy and fun to write, even though he's not actually in the narrative proper until the third book. So he's in it quite a bit in the third book. And so that was fun, like having this character that's been like built up for 2 books that we never actually meet or interact with and like, feeling like having settled on a direction and that he actually like arrives in the narrative and is a character in the narrative. That made him a lot of fun to write.
So let me ask some questions about Cora, Ampersand, and some of these other characters that explore the themes of alienation and integration. What exactly did you want the reader to come to a conclusion of with the way that they dealt with their alienation and integration into society? Because as we know, in our current day, due to late stage capitalism, we are very alienated from our own work. Are there any political ideologies that you're using to guide this discourse on alienation and integration? What was going in your mind when you were writing these mechanisms?
So in terms of the story, I think there's definitely the interpersonal character element of the trauma of losing one's society. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these alien characters are seeking to integrate into human society, because in a lot of ways, they cannot. But even if they wanted to, it's just like, are they obligated to? And I think the expectation on the human side is yes, but the answer in the case of the story so far is no. Do you have anything else?
As a person who grew up engaging with essentially your world that you created online, that has now in some ways followed in your footsteps, and God willing, will follow it in other ways. What is your view of your legacy? Do you even think of yourself as having a legacy at this point? Or does that seem or feel like something more distant, more intangible, considering the position you're in now? Or is it something you're actively engaging with and thinking about as you write your books and think about what your next move is?
Again, looking back at like 2008 when I started doing videos online, no, there wasn't such a thing as a YouTuber back then, so I could never have predicted where my career would have gone, even when I was in film school and I thought like I would end up working as like an editor in television. So I think it's, and this is what I, tell parents of kids that are like anxious, like, well, my kid wants to go to film school. And, the only thing I can say is like, you don't know what the technology is going to be in 5 years. You don't know where you could land based on like what you get swept up in. So I guess I always feel kind of uneasy making plans for what I want to do because it never worked out. Because whatever you wanted to do, something else, something more appropriate would probably show up and like kind of helped figure out what the shape of it even was. So, if there's nothing else ever, I guess there's that. And I feel like whether that remains relevant, like whether the video essay as a concept is flash in the pan, or if that's just going to be a subgenre of online content from here on out, I guess remains to be seen. I'm so genuinely glad to hear from all of you across the many continents, or at least 2 of them. This is the 3rd book in my series. It's called Apostles of Mercy. It is out June 4th. For those of you who pre-ordered it, thank you so much. I'm very, very grateful to you. And for those of you who can come see me on tour, you can find dates on my Instagram or Macmillan's website. I would love to see you in person. That would be so cool. Thank you all for watching, and thank you all fellow creators for taking the time to talk to me. It really does mean a lot. I love you all. Mwah.